Gerda was the first to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just one tear, moving straight down her face while she stared at a plate of pancakes she had not yet touched in a prisoner of war camp in Canada. On a Sunday morning in February, while a woman across from her pretended not to see it and failed. Nobody had expected this. Nobody had expected any of it. That was the problem with maple syrup. It did not behave like something that belonged in a war. The smell reached them before the bell did. Not smoke, not wet wool, not the sour, familiar cold of another empty morning in a camp buried deep in the Canadian interior, where the winters did not apologize and the silence between the pine trees stretched so far in every direction that a person could begin to believe the rest of the world had simply ceased to exist while they were not looking. This smell was different. It moved to the gap beneath the barack door and across the frozen floorboards and into the low, dark air of the room where 14 women slept on narrow cots beneath rough wool blankets issued by people who did not know their names. It was warm, sweet, dense in a way that had nothing to do with anything that belonged in a place like this. Anna Brower lifted her head from the rough pillows slowly, the way a person does when they are not yet sure whether what they are sensing is real or the last edge of a dream already dissolving at the edges. She blinked at the frost-clouded window above her cot. Outside, the sky was that particular shade of pale gray that existed in the hour before the Canadian dawn decided to commit to anything, a temporary color, a color for waiting. She could hear boots crunching over frozen ground somewhere beyond the wire. A distant voice called something in English. Routine, ordinary, the sounds of a place that had its own internal logic and had learned to conduct that logic without requiring anything from her. But that smell, it curled through the air like a question she did not know how to answer. She lay still for a moment longer. This was how she began most mornings, held in the narrow space between sleep and the requirements of the day, doing a kind of inventory she had never consciously designed but that had assembled itself over the preceding months into something automatic. She checked her body first, the way you do when your body has become something you cannot entirely trust, cataloging the presence or absence of pain, the quality of her breathing, the temperature of her feet, where they pressed against the bottom of the blanket. Then she checked the room, the sounds of it, the particular rhythm of 14 women in various states of waking. Then she checked herself more carefully, the inner atmosphere, what might be called her readiness, though that word was too purposeful for what she was actually doing, which was simply verifying that she could manage the day, that she had not lost anything in the night, that she could not do without. This morning, the inventory was interrupted by the smell. Around her, the others were stirring. She could hear in the small sounds that filled the barack each morning, the shifting of weight on wooden frames, the quiet exhale of women pulling themselves back from wherever sleep had taken them, the soft rustle of someone reaching for their coat before their eyes were fully open. Elsa, in the cot to Anna's left, sat up and pushed her hair from her face with both hands. Her expression in the pale light was the same expression it had been for weeks. Careful, contained, the expression of someone who had decided that the safest way to move through each day was to feel as little of it as possible. Elsa had been a student before the war, had rearranged her life, studying literature at a university in Leipzig, and Anna had seen enough of her, in the months they had shared this room, to understand that the containment was a conversion of something rather than a suppression of it, that the careful quality of Elsa's daily presentation was the form her intelligence had taken in conditions that did not permit its original expression. She was one of the sharpest people Anna had ever known, and she kept it almost entirely to herself, and she did this with such consistency and such skill that it had become its own kind of brilliance. But even Elsa's eyes this morning moved toward the door. Marta, who slept nearest the entrance and who had therefore developed the habit of sleeping with one shoulder turned toward whatever might come through it, was already sitting upright with her arms folded over her knees. She was frowning, which for Marta meant something specific. Marta frowned when she was confused. She had not been confused in a long time because confusion required the possibility of surprise, and surprise had been systematically removed from their lives over the preceding years by the slow grinding efficiency of a war that had made everything predictable in the worst possible ways. Before all of this, Marta had been a practical person, someone who dealt in facts and logistics, who had worked as an administrator, who had kept meticulous records and had an almost physical discomfort with ambiguity. The war had not changed this. It had simply given her discomfort with ambiguity, a much larger domain to operate in. She frowned when things did not compute. She frowned now. "Do you smell that?" Elsa whispered. Anna nodded before she could stop herself. For a moment, no one moved. They had all learned, in the months before their capture and in the weeks since arriving at this camp, that the correct response to anything unexpected was stillness. Motion drew attention. Attention brought consequences. Stillness was the only reliable currency they had left, and they spent it carefully. But the smell kept coming. Warm batter on hot metal. Something richer beneath it, darker, sweeter. The kind of sweetness that did not belong to the war years, that belonged instead to a version of the world that existed on the other side of everything that had happened, in kitchens and Sunday mornings, and the ordinary hours that none of them had understood were extraordinary until they were gone. Gerda, the oldest among them at 34, who had worked as a records clerk in a military administrative office before the front collapsed around her unit and swept her into captivity along with everything else, sat on the edge of her cot and pressed both palms flat against her thighs the way she always did when she was trying to organize her thoughts. She was a deliberate woman, not slow but considered, someone for whom the space between receiving information and responding to it was occupied by actual thought rather than reflex. She had a particular stillness about her, even in motion, a quality of moving to the world without disturbing more of it than necessary. She said nothing now. She simply tilted her head slightly in the direction of the door, as if she were trying to hear the smell rather than breathe it. In the far corner, young Hilda, who was 19 years old and who had not yet learned how to make her face say anything other than exactly what she was thinking, looked at Anna with wide eyes and mouthed a single word that Anna could not quite read in the dim light, but suspected was simply, "What?" Then there was Clara. Clara occupied the cot nearest the back wall and had, since the first day of their arrival, existed in the shared space of the barack as a presence more than a participant. She was perhaps 24, though it was difficult to be certain, and she had the kind of face that gave nothing away, not from coldness but from an apparent genuine indifference to what others might read into her expressions. She had been a radio operator before her capture, which perhaps explained something about her comfort with silence, with the idea that communication did not require speech, that the most important transmissions were often the ones that moved between people without words. She had said, in the weeks Anna had known her, perhaps 40 words. She was not unfriendly. She was simply somewhere else most of the time, present in body and elsewhere in everything that mattered, and the other women had learned to read the occasional signals she offered, a nod, a small adjustment of posture, the particular quality of her attention when something engaged it, and to understand these as a currency of a person who had decided that speech was expensive and spent accordingly. This morning, Clara was sitting upright on her cot with her eyes open and her face turned toward the door, and even she, even Clara, had the look of someone who had received information she had not anticipated. They dressed without speaking, which was how they did most things in the morning. Coarse camp uniforms. Worn boots that had walked further than boots were designed to walk before arriving here. Coats that had been issued at intake, and that fit none of them correctly because they had been sized for people whose lives had not yet removed so much from their frames. They moved through the barack with the quiet efficiency of women who had learned to take up as little space as possible in the physical world, lining up in the narrow aisle between the cots with the automatic discipline that months of routine had carved into their muscle memory. One by one they filed toward the door. Anna went third. She paused for just a moment at the threshold, not from hesitation exactly, but from the specific quality of attention that the smell had produced in her, the sense of something just ahead that required more than her usual readiness. The bell rang while they were still inside, a single flat clang of metal against metal that traveled across the compound with the indifference of everything in this place. They filed out through the door and into the morning air, and it hit them immediately, the cold and the smell together, the cold pressing down from the white sky above the pine tree-line, and the smell rising from somewhere across the compound, from the direction of the long wooden building that housed the kitchen, warm and impossible, and completely at odds with everything around it. Anna stopped walking for half a second, without meaning to. The woman behind her, Clara, stepped around her without comment and kept moving. They crossed the frozen ground in a loose column, their breath making small, brief clouds that disappeared almost immediately in the still air. The compound was already moving around them. Canadian soldiers conducting morning routines near the equipment sheds. An officer crossing from the administrative building toward the watchtower with a clipboard under his arm. 2 guards standing at the perimeter near the eastern fence, both of them young enough that Anna, who was 26, felt inexplicably older looking at them. One of the things that had surprised her most about the camp, in those first disorienting days after arrival, was how young so many of the soldiers were. She had expected authority to look older. She had expected captors to look like the version of the enemy she had constructed in her mind during the years when the enemy had been an abstract concept rather than a specific 20-year-old from a place she had never heard of who now held a clipboard with her name on it. She had expected something harder, something that would confirm what she had been told about these people, what she had been given as fact during the years when fact was dispensed by the state with the same efficiency as every other resource. Instead, she had found something more confusing than cruelty, which was ordinariness. People doing their jobs. People who were cold in the morning and warmer by midday, and who sometimes laughed at things near the equipment sheds, and who looked at the prisoners with expressions that ranged from professional neutrality to something approaching discomfort, as though the arrangement required them to perform a version of themselves they were not entirely comfortable with. The pine trees beyond the wire stood in their usual positions, enormous and indifferent, the kind of trees that had been there before any of this and would be there after, that operated on a timescale so different from the one that had produced a war and a camp and 14 women walking across frozen gravel in column formation, that the whole situation was, from the tree's perspective, barely worth noting. Anna looked at them sometimes when the compound felt too small, which it always did, but more so on certain days, and found something in their absolute indifference that was not comforting exactly, but was at least true in a way that nothing else in her immediate environment was. The mess hall stood at the northern end of the compound. It was a long rectangular building made of wood that had weathered to a pale silvery gray, with 2 windows cut into each long wall and a metal chimney at one end from which a thin ribbon of smoke rose in a perfectly straight line in the windless morning air. The door stood open despite the cold, which was itself unusual. In Anna's experience, doors in this camp were kept closed in winter unless there was a specific reason for them not to be, and an open door usually meant something was happening near it or expected to happen near it. From inside came sounds that were also unusual, not the scrape and clatter of a kitchen producing the minimum required, the thin efficient sounds of a place serving people because it was obligated to, but something more active, something that sounded impossibly like effort, like someone inside that building had put actual thought into what was about to happen. The smell, which had been present all morning as a background question, was now so close and so strong that it was almost physical, a pressure against the senses, warm and sweet and dense with something that Anna could not quite name, but that her body recognized before her mind had finished processing it. A group of Canadian soldiers stood near the entrance. Some of them were carrying trays. One of them, a corporal with a broad face and reddish hair and the kind of easy stance that belonged to people who had never had a reason to make themselves small, was grinning at nothing in particular, just holding that expression the way people do when they are genuinely pleased about something and have not yet located anyone to share it with. When he saw the women approaching, he straightened slightly and his grin shifted into something more deliberate, more welcoming, and he said something in English that none of them caught completely, but that the translator, a small, tired-looking man named Gillis, who had been attached to the camp specifically to bridge the language gap, and who always looked as though the job was costing him something personal, repeated in German a moment later. "Maple syrup and pancakes today, girls." The column stopped. Not all at once. It rippled to a halt the way things do when the people at the front have received information that the people at the back have not yet processed. Anna, who was third in line, watched Marta's shoulders go very still in front of her, watched the slight turn of Gerda's head, watched Hilda, somewhere behind her, say the word pancakes quietly to herself in German, the word landing in her mouth like a foreign object she was trying to identify by taste. Nobody moved. The corporal's grin held. Gillis looked at his boots. From somewhere inside the mess hall, the smell intensified, rolling out through the open door in a warm, invisible wave that had no business being as powerful as it was, that should not have been able to reach inside a person the way it did, that should not have been capable of doing in 3 seconds what weeks of routine had not done, which was to make every one of those women feel, just for a moment, the specific quality of their own hunger, Not the hunger for food, though that was present too. The deeper hunger, the one that did not have a simple name. The hunger for recognition, the hunger for the ordinary, the hunger for a world in which a Sunday morning was a Sunday morning, and not simply another unit of time in a sequence of units that began and ended with bells and guards and a particular flatness of days that were identical to the days before them in every way that mattered. They went inside. The room was larger than it looked from the outside, the way rooms sometimes are when they have been arranged with thought rather than indifference. Long wooden tables ran in 2 rows from one end to the other, already set, tin plates and utensils laid out with a regularity that suggested someone had taken the time to do it properly rather than simply placing things in the general vicinity of where they needed to be. Morning light came through the windows on the eastern side in long pale rectangles that fell across the tables and caught the steam rising from the serving station along the near wall in a way that made the steam briefly visible, briefly beautiful, before it dissolved into the air above their heads. The room smelled the way it had smelled from outside, but more so, more present, more specific, warm batter and butter, and something underneath both of those that was darker and sweeter and more complicated, and that Anna would later identify as the smell of the syrup itself, which had its own quality, distinct from sweetness in general, something more particular than sweet, something that belonged to a specific geography and a specific tree and a specific time of year, in which that tree was tapped and its sap collected and processed into this amber-dark substance that was now, impossibly, in a glass jar on a serving counter, in a Canadian prisoner of war camp on a Sunday morning in February. Anna stopped just inside the door and looked at the serving station. There were pancakes, stacked in short golden towers on a wide flat pan, their surfaces slightly irregular, their edges curved and soft, each one catching the light differently because they were not uniform. They had been made by a person rather than produced by a process, and the slight variations between them, the different edges, the slightly darker patches where the batter had rested against the hot pan for a moment longer, the uneven rise of the stack, all of this communicated handmade in a way that Anna had not expected, and that registered somewhere beneath language as something important. There was butter in a bowl, real butter, the kind of soft pale yellow that belonged to cold mornings and warm kitchens, and a version of breakfast that she had not allowed herself to think about in a very long time, because thinking about it was a specific kind of cruelty she had learned to avoid. And there was the syrup, amber dark in a large glass jar, the kind of deep warm brown that you could see light moving through if the angle was right, which it was, and the light from the eastern windows was doing exactly that, passing to the jar and catching the liquid inside and illuminating from within, so that it seemed almost aglow, almost to generate its own warmth, and it cast a small honey-colored shadow on the wooden surface beneath it that moved slightly whenever anyone walked past, because the jar was not perfectly still, and neither was the morning, and neither, Anna realized, was she. A woman in a kitchen apron stood behind the station with a ladle, and when she looked at the women filing, and she gave a small nod that was neither warm nor cold, just straightforwardly human, an acknowledgement that they existed and that she was there to serve them, and that this was a complete and uncomplicated reality of the situation. There was nothing in her expression that suggested she had thought very much about who these women were, or what they had done, or what had been done to them, or what any of that meant. She was simply there to serve breakfast, and breakfast was pancakes and maple syrup, and she was ready to do this the same way. She was ready every morning to do whatever it was that morning required. This must be for the soldiers. One of the women behind Anna said quietly, not accusatory, not bitter, just the only rational explanation available, because the other explanation, the one in which this food was actually for them, did not fit inside the framework their experience had built for them. Prisoner of war camps did not serve pancakes with maple syrup. That was simply not a category of thing that happened. The food was for the soldiers, and there had been some mistake or some miscommunication, and it would be corrected shortly, and they would receive their usual breakfast, and the morning would proceed in the direction mornings in this camp always proceeded. But Gillis shook his head and repeated the words Gillis had already said. No, this is for you. The room did something then. It did not make a sound. The doing was entirely internal, entirely invisible, and therefore impossible to describe with any accuracy. But everyone present could feel it happening the way you can feel a room change temperature even before you can measure the change. Something shifted in the air between the women and the serving counter. Some quality of the space between them altered, and Anna was aware of the way she was aware of her own breathing, not constantly, but in the moments when attention fell on it naturally. She moved toward a table without quite deciding to. She sat down on the bench and looked at the empty tin plate in front of her, and then looked at the serving station, and then looked at the plate again. Elsa had sat down beside her with the same automatic quality, and was now doing what Anna was doing, which was sitting with her hands in her lap, and not quite being able to take the next step, because the next step was to go to the serving counter and accept the food, and accepting the food meant accepting that it was real, and accepting that it was real meant accepting what it implied, which was something large enough and complicated enough that none of them were quite ready to look at it directly. The kitchen woman came to them with the pan of pancakes, and placed 3 on Anna's plate, without ceremony. The sound they made when they landed on the tin was soft, insubstantial almost. Food that had weight without heaviness. Then the butter, a spoonful placed to the side where it would melt slowly into whatever it touched. Then the syrup. The woman tilted the jar and poured in a slow, steady stream over the top of the stack, and the amber liquid moved across the surface of the pancakes the way water moves across a flat stone, finding the edges, pooling in the small depressions, catching the light from the window and turning it into something that had no right to exist in a prisoner of war camp in the interior of Canada, in a winter that had not finished deciding how cold it intended to be. The woman said nothing. She simply moved to the next person, and began again. Elsa leaned slightly toward Anna and said in a voice barely above a murmur, "Is it some kind of ration?" Anna did not answer. She was looking at the plate. She was aware that she was looking at it too long, that there was something slightly destabilizing about the looking, that the plate of pancakes and syrup was doing something to her that she had not given it permission to do, reaching past careful layers she had built over preceding months and touching something beneath them that she had thought was safely unreachable. She became aware of a sensation she had not experienced in a long time and could not immediately name. It took her a moment to identify it. It was longing, specific and physical and directed not at the food itself, but at whatever the food represented, at the world in which food like this was ordinary, in which Sunday was Sunday and breakfast was warm and life had not been reduced to the careful management of its own continuation. Across the table, Gerda had not moved. She was sitting in the same posture she had assumed when she sat down, back straight, hands folded on the table in front of her plate, and she was looking at the food in front of her with an expression that Anna recognized after a moment as the expression of someone trying to remember something that kept slipping away before they could get hold of it. The look of a person reaching for something just beyond the edge of their own memory. The look of almost but not yet. The look that happens in the moment between forgetting and remembering when you are suspended between the two and cannot see either shore. Her plate sat untouched in front of her. The syrup had pooled at the edges of the stack and was beginning to move slowly toward the rim of the plate. The butter sat in a small, neat spoonful to the side. The steam had begun to thin. Hilda, at the far end of the table, had picked up her fork immediately upon sitting down, which was so characteristic of Hilda, who was 19 and had not yet completed the process of removing hope from her daily operating procedure, that several of the other women glanced at her. Hilda was the youngest of them and the most transparent, a fact she was probably not fully aware of, because the transparency that others could see in her was invisible to her in the same way that your own face is invisible to you except in mirrors. She felt things, and the things she felt showed immediately on her face, and she could not help this, and had apparently not yet learned to regard it as a vulnerability. Several of the older women had developed, over the months of their shared captivity, a kind of protective instinct toward Hilda that none of them had ever spoken aloud, but that was present in the way they positioned themselves in relation to her, the way they occasionally absorbed situations on her behalf without making it obvious. But even Hilda had paused, fork in hand, staring down at the plate with an expression that was entirely new, the expression of someone who's been caught off guard by their own reaction to something and is not sure what to do with what they have found. Anna made herself pick up her own fork, made herself cut through the top pancake. The resistance was minimal, almost none, the way well-made things rarely resist the thing they were designed for. She lifted the piece to her mouth. She chewed, and then she stopped, not because something was wrong, because something was so precisely right that her entire system of recent experience had no framework for processing it. The pancake was warm all the way through, not the surface warmth of something heated quickly and then left to cool from the inside out, but genuinely, evenly warm, the warmth of something made with care, and then served immediately while it was still exactly what it was supposed to be. The batter was soft, slightly sweet on its own without the syrup, and the syrup moved through it the way good things move through you when you've been without them long enough to have forgotten their specific weight. Not rushing, not overwhelming, just present. There was butter underneath, and it had melted into the layers, and the combination of all of these things together, the warmth and the softness and the sweetness and the particular weight of the batter itself, did something that Anna had not anticipated. It reached back, not metaphorically, not in any way that she could describe to someone who had not experienced it. It physically, literally reached back through preceding years and grabbed something that she had packed away so carefully and so completely that she had begun to believe it was simply gone, that the careful packing had become permanent, that what she had stored was no longer accessible to her, that she had performed such a complete preservation of these things by sealing them away from conditions that would have destroyed them, that she had, in the process, also sealed them away from herself. She was 7 years old. The kitchen in the apartment on Lindenstrasse. April, because there was light coming to the window at that particular early morning angle that only happened in spring when the days were still deciding how long to be, the light that arrived sideways and caught particles in the air and made the ordinary room briefly luminous. The sound of batter hitting the pan and the specific sizzle of it, the way that sound changed as the batter spread and settled. First, the initial shock of liquid against heat, and then the lower, more settled sound of something finding its shape. And beneath that sizzle, smaller, the sound of her mother humming something tuneless and private, the kind of humming that people do when they're alone, even when they're not alone, when they are so comfortable that the presence of others has ceased to require any particular performance. Her mother hummed when she cooked. Not songs, not anything with identifiable melody, just sound, the audible version of thinking about nothing in particular, of being entirely present in a moment without any need to account for it. Her younger brother Peter, 6 years old and already conducting his life with a tremendous urgency and complete commitment that characterized everything he did, was in the next room moving something heavy across the floor in the service of some project whose logic existed only in his own mind. She could hear the deliberate rhythm of it, the pause between each scrape as he assessed the progress of whatever he was building or rearranging or constructing, with the absolute seriousness of a 6-year-old who has identified a task and will not be diverted from it by anything as trivial as other people's need for quiet. She could hear the radio in the room beyond that. Her father was reading a newspaper, and the radio was playing something instrumental and ordinary, neither demanding nor intrusive, just present the way furniture is present, filling a space without requiring attention. The apartment smelled of coffee and batter, and the particular smell of her parents' kitchen, which she could not describe then, and cannot describe now except by saying that it was the smell of a specific place occupied by specific people who were alive in it and who had made it, over years of ordinary mornings, into something that no other place had ever been. Nothing about that morning had been in any way remarkable. She had not known at 7 that this was what she was doing, cataloging the unremarkable. She had not known that the specific warmth of that kitchen and the specific sound of her mother humming and the specific weight of her brother's laughter moving through 2 walls in a hallway were things that would need to be stored, that would need to be kept somewhere safe against the possibility of a future in which they would be the only form of those things that remained. She had not known that the radio would one day play nothing but warnings. She had not known that the city would one day be something to fear rather than something to live in. She had not known that Peter, who was 6 years old and moving something heavy across the floor for reasons that made complete sense to him, would one day be old enough to be inducted, and that she would receive one letter from him, and then nothing, and that the nothing would become so present in her life that she would learn to live around it the way you live around a gap in a floor you have learned not to step into. She had simply eaten her breakfast. She had simply been a child in a warm kitchen on an April morning, before the world had learned to cost so much. The memory broke. She was back. The fork was still in her hand. The plate was in front of her. The mess hall was around her, full of the quiet sounds of women eating, and Anna became aware that her throat had tightened in a way that was difficult to manage, and that her vision had developed the particular quality that preceded something she had spent months successfully preventing. She put the fork down carefully, with a small sound against the tin plate. She placed both hands flat on the table, on either side of the plate. She looked at the window. The light through the glass was winter light, cold and even and completely unlike the April light she had just been inhabiting, and she used that difference to pull herself back, to use the gap between what she remembered and what was actually in front of her as a kind of anchor. It worked. Mostly. She picked the fork back up. She took another bite. This time she let herself stay in the room. But staying in the room meant being aware of what was happening in it. And what was happening at the other end of the table was something she could not quite look at directly. Gerda had not moved. Her food sat in front of her untouched, the syrup still gleaming where it had pooled, the butter sitting in its small, neat spoonful, the pancakes cooling slowly in the February air that moved through the room even here, even inside. She was looking at it with the same expression she had arrived with, the one that looked like arithmetic, the expression of someone solving something that does not have a numerical answer. And then Anna watched that expression change. It changed the way weather changes when a system that has been holding for days finally decides to move. Not dramatically, not all at once, just a shift in pressure, internal and invisible first, and then visible because of what it produced, which was a single tear that moved from the outer corner of Gerda's right eye straight down her face with the directness of something that had been held a long time and was not, now that it had begun, going to be redirected. It reached the line of her jaw and held there for a moment, and then fell, and Gerda did not move to catch it. She did not lift her hand to her face. She did not change her posture or the angle of her gaze. She simply sat with a tear on her face and looked at the food in front of her and made no sound at all. Anna looked at Marta. Marta was looking at Gerda. Then Marta was looking at the table. Then Marta's jaw was moving in the small, specific way that happens when a person is working extremely hard at something that has nothing to do with anything visible. Elsa had turned her face toward the window and was pressing the back of one hand against her mouth with a firmness that suggested she was holding something in place that very much wanted to come out. Hilda at the far end of the table had put her fork down without appearing to notice she had done it. She was watching Gerda with an expression that was complicated by the fact that she was 19 and had not yet learned to keep her face from showing the process of understanding something for the first time, the exact moment at which a thing shifts from being a word you know to being a reality you have entered. The Canadian corporal had noticed the silence. He stepped away from the wall he had been leaning against, his easy stance shifting into something more uncertain. The specific uncertainty of a person who has done something with a particular intention and is now watching produce an effect they did not plan for and do not entirely know how to navigate. He said something to Gillis. Gillis moved through the tables toward them and leaned down near Gerda and spoke quietly in German. Gerda did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice was so low and so careful that Anna, sitting less than 2 meters away, could barely hear it. Gillis straightened slowly. He walked back to the corporal. He spoke in English, and Anna, whose English was limited to what she had studied in school and retained imperfectly through disuse and fear, caught enough to understand that he was doing his best to translate not just the words but the weight behind them, which was a different and considerably harder task. "Is something wrong?" the corporal had asked. The answer Gillis had translated was this: "They say it tastes like before." The corporal stood with that sentence for a moment. The mess hall was quiet in a way it had not been when they walked in, a different kind of quiet, one that had replaced the ambient noise of people eating with something more like the quality of air in a room, where something important has just been understood, and no one is quite sure what to do with the understanding yet. He did not ask before what. Later, Anna would think about that. Would think about the fact that he had heard those 3 words and had understood immediately that they were not an explanation, but an entire world compressed into a grammatical structure too small to hold it, and that he had had the specific intelligence or instinct or decency, she was not sure which, to understand that asking for clarification would be a kind of violence against something that was already fragile. He stood with it instead. He let it be what it was. And then he nodded once. And the nod was not the nod of someone who understood, because he did not and could not. It was a nod of someone who recognized the limit of their own understanding and was choosing to honor what he could not reach. Marta wiped her face with the back of her hand. She did it briskly, practically, the way she did everything, as though the tears were simply a logistical inconvenience to be managed efficiently. Then she made a sound that was short and slightly broken and shook her head slowly. "Imagine this," she said quietly. crying over pancakes. Elsa still had her hand against her mouth. She answered without turning from the window, "We are not crying over pancakes." Nobody disputed this, because what they were crying for, those who were crying and those who were fighting not to, was a list so long and so specific and so heavy that it could not be placed on a table or served on a plate or adequately acknowledged in any physical space. And yet somehow, in the absurd and accidental alchemy of a Sunday morning and a jar of maple syrup, it found a point of entry that all the months of careful containment had failed to anticipate. It had slipped through the gap between the expected and the actual, through the space that exists when reality turns out to be different from what you're prepared for, and it had reached the thing underneath all the preparation, which was simply the accumulated weight of everything that had been lost, and everything that was uncertain, and everything that had been endured without permission to feel it properly while it was happening. They were crying for kitchens, for the specific smell of their mother's kitchens, each one different, each one the most important smell in the world for a period of years that none of them had known to be grateful for while it was happening. They were crying for bread that had been baked in a particular oven, in a particular apartment, in a particular city that may or may not have still had that apartment, and that oven, and the woman who knew how to use it, for the specific way of a coffee cup in the morning, the particular handle of the particular cup on a particular table, the way the light came through a specific window, at a specific angle, on a specific day of the week that was different from all the other days in ways so small that they had never had to articulate them, had never needed to, because the difference was simply there and they had simply lived inside it. They were crying for brothers. For Peter, Anna's brother, who had been the kind of little boy who moves heavy things across floors for reasons that make sense only to him, who had been inducted and whose one letter had arrived and whose silence, since it had become a room, she lived in without having chosen it. For Marta's brother, who had been 18 when the war started, and who would have been 23 now if 23 was something he had reached, and Marta did not know and had spent 14 months not knowing and had learned to build her days around the not knowing in the way that you build a house around a hole in the ground, structuring everything carefully to avoid the gap, designing the floor plan so that no door opened onto it, so that you could live in the house without ever, standing directly above it, even though it was always there, and you were always aware that it was there. They were crying for Sunday mornings specifically, for the particular quality of Sunday morning the years before the war, the different texture of it, the way time moved more slowly, and the city made different sounds, smaller sounds, more domestic sounds, the sounds of people who were not going anywhere urgent and did not need to, for the radio programs that existed only on Sunday, the ones that were gentler and longer and less interested in the kind of news that required you to pay close attention, for the specific boredom of Sunday afternoons that they would now have traded anything to back, the productive, comfortable, unremarkable boredom of a person who is not afraid of what the next hour might bring. They were crying for the unbearable shock, specifically and precisely the shock of being treated like human beings. This was perhaps the most disorienting element of all, and it was the one that Anna had the most difficulty naming even to herself, because to name it was to acknowledge the size of what had been taken. To say, "I am surprised to be treated well," was to say I had learned to expect not to be, and to say that was to measure the distance between the person she had been in that April kitchen on Lindenstrasse and the person sitting on this bench, and the distance was enormous in a way she had been managing not to look at directly. The pancakes had made her look at it. Something so small and warm and ordinary had cut through every layer of adaptation and management and reached the thing underneath. And the thing underneath was not broken exactly. It was just very tired and very far from home, and had not, until this moment, been offered anything that felt like acknowledgement. A younger Canadian guard came through from the kitchen, carrying a large metal pitcher. He walked up to the tables and spoke to Gillis quietly. Gillis translated. "He says there is more if anyone wants it." Gerda made a sound that she immediately tried to convert into something else and failed. Even Marta, who had recovered her composure with the speed and efficiency that characterized everything she did, produced a smile that arrived unexpectedly on her face and stayed there in a slightly disbelieving way, as though she was not entirely sure it belonged to her. They stayed at the tables longer than anyone required them to. The soldiers and guards did not hurry them. The kitchen woman refilled the syrup jar without being asked. Gillis sat down on a bench near the door and looked at nothing in particular, and was quiet, which Anna appreciated, because Gillis was one of those people who understood that some moments are not improved by language. Outside, the morning was continuing to happen. The light through the eastern windows had moved, the way light always moves without anyone noticing until it is somewhere entirely different. The camp beyond the glass was conducting its ordinary business. But inside the mess hall, time was moving at a different speed, the specific slower speed of a moment that is being felt rather than processed. And Anna had the distinct sense that all of them, the women at the tables, and even some of the soldiers near the walls, were inside the same moment in some way that had nothing to do with sides or wire or the administrative categories that had placed them on opposite ends of this particular room. When they finally rose, it was gradual. Gerda stood first, carefully, with the deliberate precision of someone who has learned to treat every action as something that deserves thought. She picked up her plate, which she had finished, and carried it to the place near the kitchen door where plates were left. Then Marta, then Elsa, then one by one the others. Hilda was the last to stand. She stood the way she did most things, which was a kind of complete, unguarded presence that the others had largely moved past, and that Anna found, in this particular moment, quietly devastating in a way that genuine things are devastating when you spend a long time among things that are managed and contained and carefully presented. Outside, the snow melted from the night before it had frozen again in the cold of the early morning, and then begun to loosen again as the sun climbed. And so the ground between the mess hall and the barracks was an alternation of frozen patches and small channels of water moving through the gravel, and they picked their way across it with the careful attention that ice requires. The pine trees beyond the wire stood in the same formation they always stood in, indifferent, patient, older than anything in the camp by centuries. The crow that lived somewhere in the eastern trees called from an invisible branch. The sound of it traveled across the compound, and then there was silence again. Elsa walked beside Anna. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Elsa said, "Do you think they knew what would do?" Anna considered this. She thought about the corporal and his easy grin, about the kitchen woman who had poured the syrup without ceremony, simply doing the thing she was there to do, about the young guard with the extra pitcher, who had walked over with the specific expression of someone who genuinely wanted to know if anyone needed more. She thought about the fact that this had been described to them as simply what was being made this morning. Sunday, because it was Sunday, because that was what people made. She thought about the enormous gap between what that meant to people who had made it and what it had produced in the people who had eaten it, the gap between the ordinary and the catastrophic, and how that gap was not a measure of carelessness, but of something almost the opposite. The specific kindness of people who give you something ordinary because they believe you are ordinary too, because they have not decided that your circumstances revoke your claim to the unremarkable. "No," Anna said. "I think that's exactly why it mattered." Elsa nodded slowly. They walked the rest of the way to the barracks in silence. Inside, the room smelled the same as it always smelled, the cold and wool, and the faint impersonal smell of 14 women sharing a small space. And this was so at odds with the smell that had woken them that the contrast landed with a small, quiet force. The women sat on their cots, and for a while no one spoke. This was not the usual silence of the Barak, which was a functional silence, a silence of people doing what needed to be done or conserving what needed to be conserved. This was a different kind of silence, the kind that exists in the wake of something that has happened to everyone simultaneously, but that each person is processing alone, that exists in the shared aftermath of a shared experience that has not yet been made into language. Then Clara spoke. Clara, who had said perhaps 40 words since their capture, who existed in the shared space of the Barak as a presence more than a participant, who communicated to the quality of her attention rather than through speech, who had been a radio operator and who understood perhaps better than anyone in the room the difference between a signal and noise, said something without preface or context, the way people speak when they have been quiet long enough that the words come out without the usual social architecture around them. "My mother used to make something like that," she said, "with different flour. Thinner, but the same smell." Everyone in the room looked at her. Clara appeared not to notice. She was looking at her hands in her lap, turning them palm up and then palm down in a slow, repeated motion that she was probably not aware of. In summer, she would make them on Sunday mornings with preserved plum on top instead of syrup. We had a plum tree in the garden, the whole tree for us. It was enormous. Every August, we had more plums than we could use, and my mother would spend 3 days making preserves, and we would eat plum on everything for the rest of the year. She paused. My father would not come to breakfast until he had finished his morning reading. It took him 40 minutes, and we were not allowed to eat until he sat down. My sister and I used to steal pieces from the kitchen and eat them standing up behind the door, so we would not be hungry by the time he finally appeared. She almost smiled. The almost was so visible that several of the women in the room felt it physically. Tell me more, Hilda said. She said it with the complete directness of someone who is 19 and does not yet have the self-consciousness to dress sincerity in anything more elaborate than what it is. The words came out simply and completely and without any of the hesitation or qualification that older, more defended people attach to requests for things they actually want. And then something happened in that Barak room that Anna could not have predicted and would spend a long time afterward trying to understand. They talked, not about the camp, not about the war, not about the practical negotiations of daily survival that constituted most of their conversation. They talked about food from before, about kitchens from before, about breakfast and Sunday mornings and the specific foods of specific regions, and the arguments between families about the correct way to make things and the smells that had belonged to particular people and particular seasons and particular days of the week that existed only in memory now. Preserved the way Clara's mother had preserved plums, packed in something sweet to keep them from spoiling, to keep them available for the winter. Gerda spoke about her grandmother's kitchen in Bavaria, the black iron stove that had heated the entire ground floor of the farmhouse, and that her grandmother managed with the specific authority of someone who has operated the same equipment for 40 years and knows it the way a musician knows their instrument, its particular quirks and moods, and the things it could do that other stoves of the same type could not. The bread that emerged from that oven, Gerda said, was something that existed nowhere else in the world, not because her grandmother had a secret recipe, though she had recipes, but because the oven had been used so many times for the same purpose that it had absorbed something of that purpose, had been seasoned by decades of bread in a way that altered what it produced. She had tried, in her apartment in Munich, using the same recipe to make the same bread. It had been good bread, but it had not been that bread. The oven had not known what it was doing yet. Anna spoke about her mother, and the April mornings and the radio and Peter's projects conducted at enormous volume in the next room. She spoke about a particular Saturday in October, 2 years before the war had started, when her father had taken them all to a festival in the park, and the weather had been impossibly perfect, the kind of perfect that you know is fragile while it is happening. And they had eaten outside at a long wooden table, and Peter had eaten so many pretzels that he declared himself unable to walk and had to be carried part of the way home, which he had found extremely funny and had talked about for weeks afterward. She had not thought about that afternoon in a very long time. It came back now with a completeness that surprised her, every detail intact, the particular blue of the sky and the smell of roasting chestnuts from a cart at the edge of the park and the sound of her father's laugh, which was a specific sound that she had not thought about since losing access to it, but that was still there, perfectly preserved, available to her the moment she reached for it. Elsa spoke about the cafe near the university. She spoke about it differently than she had told it to Anna before, more specifically, more slowly, with the quality of someone who has decided to actually tell a thing rather than indicate that a thing could be told. The cafe was called something she could not quite remember, but it had blue chairs. She remembered the blue chairs specifically, and the coffee was too strong and the pastries were too expensive, but on Saturday mornings in her first year, she had sat there alone for 3 hours at a stretch with a book and a pastry and the strong coffee, and had been so thoroughly and completely happy that she had not recognized it as happiness. She had thought it was just Saturday morning. She had thought that was simply what Saturday mornings were, that this quality of life was the baseline rather than the exception, that she would have other Saturday mornings of this kind for the rest of her life in indefinite supply. She said this without bitterness and without sentimentality. She said it with a specific, clear-eyed sadness of someone who has done the work of understanding something difficult and arrived at the understanding whole, who has looked at the loss directly and named it accurately and is now simply living with the accuracy. Even Marta spoke about her brother. She did not do it directly. She used we, and we contained him without naming him, and everyone in the room understood what the we meant, and no one pressed her to make it explicit, because there was no need, and because pressing her would have been the wrong kind of attention to pay to something that was being offered in a specific way for specific reasons. She spoke about Sunday mornings in their apartment, when they were children, when their parents worked the early shift on weekends and the two of them had the kitchen to themselves. She spoke about standing on a stool to reach the counter. She spoke about the catastrophic results of their early experiments with recipes that required skill they did not yet have, the burned edges and the collapsed centers, and the things that had to be quietly disposed of before their parents came home, and how the failures had been funnier than any success could have been, how the laughter produced by a completely collapsed attempt at something ambitious had a specific quality that no successful version of the same thing could have produced. The point was never the food, she said. The point was the kitchen, and us in it. She stopped speaking. She looked at her hands. Then she said, very quietly, he would have been 23 now. No one said anything. There was nothing said that was adequate, and they were a group of women who had learned the hard way that the inadequate was worse than the silent. But the silence this time was not the silence of people maintaining necessary distance. It was the silence of people sitting together with something very heavy and choosing not to put it down, because putting it down would mean admitting that it could be put down, and none of them was ready for that. So they held it together without speaking, and the holding was its own form of acknowledgement, and the acknowledgement was its own form of something that had no name but that was necessary, and that all of them, in this room, on this Sunday afternoon in Canada, were finally able to offer each other. The afternoon came in gradually through the frosted windows, the light shifting from the pale silver morning to the slightly warmer pale gold of a Canadian winter afternoon, which was warmer in color only and not in temperature. The conversation had moved through several iterations, had become lighter in places, had discovered small moments of the ridiculous that all of their stories contained if you look for them, had produced small laughs in 2 or 3 instances that surprised the people who produced them, that emerged in the automatic way that laughter sometimes does when you are in a group of people who decided, without explicitly deciding, to be present with each other rather than defended against each other. Evening came. The light through the windows turned briefly orange and then gray and then was gone. The bell rang for the evening meal. They filed out and back again. The night routine assembled itself around them like something they barely had to think about anymore. Cots, blankets, the sounds of a room settling into sleep. Anna lay on her back in the dark and looked at the ceiling and listened to the breathing of the women around her change as they went under one by one. Hilda went first, the way she always did, with the absolute totality of the young. Clara next, her breathing slowing in the measured way of someone who had made peace with sleep, if not with everything else. Gerda last, as always. But tonight, even Gerda went under earlier than usual. Tonight the breathing in the room slowed and deepened with less resistance, and the small sounds of women who could not sleep were fewer than usual and shorter. Anna listened to the wind move across the outside of the barack walls. She thought about the corporal's sentence and turned it over in her mind with a particular attention. She gave things she intended to keep. Maple syrup and pancakes today, girls, said with a grin, said casually, said the way you say a thing when you believe the people you are saying it to are ordinary enough to deserve the ordinary. That was it. That was the thing she had been trying to name all afternoon. He had not offered them something special. He had offered them something common, something his own family probably had on Sunday mornings without thinking twice about it. He had given them the specific and irreplaceable gift of the unremarkable, and in doing so had said, without words and without intention, and therefore with more force than any intentional statement could have carried, that he saw them, not as prisoners, not as the enemy, not as a category or a consequence or a problem to be managed, as people who might reasonably want pancakes on a Sunday morning, because that was what people wanted. She stared at the ceiling. Outside, somewhere beyond the wire, the crow was silent for the night. The pine trees stood in the dark, patient and indifferent and ancient, waiting out yet another human drama with the equanimity of things that had watched so many of them that they had become structurally incapable of surprise. The camp was still. The wind moved, and the walls held. And in the barracks, 14 German POW women slept, all of them, deeply, the way people sleep when something they had stopped believing has been quietly, accidentally, returned to them. Not freedom, not safety, not answers to the questions that had no answers yet. Something smaller and more durable than any of those things. The knowledge that they were still people to whom a warm breakfast on a Sunday morning could mean something. that they were still made of all the kitchens and all the mornings and all the April light they had ever known, that the war had taken almost everything and could not take that, and to close her eyes. She did not know if Peter had reached 23, but she knew she still needed to find out, and that in the dark of that barack on that Sunday night in Canada, with the smell of maple syrup still present somewhere in her memory, which had by now become the same thing as still present in the room, was enough. It was enough to keep her oriented toward morning, enough to keep the future as a direction rather than an absence, enough to make the next day something she was moving toward rather than something that was simply arriving whether she wanted it to or not. That was what a plate of pancakes had done. That was all it had taken. That was everything.